You can vote with a ballot, you can vote with your wallet, but it's always a vote for the pricks. So let me tell you this for free, my next vote's with a brick. Down from somewhere behind the barricade, beyond the lies and the rhetoric.
Hello and welcome back to Vote with a Brick, our bi-weekly podcast. I don't know if we really specified at the beginning that this was going to be a every other week podcast. So I recorded a short little mini-sode last week, and we're going to be taking that down and putting this episode in its place. Welcome back.
Like all good leftist ideas, we have an idea, and then when reality comes to a place, we must immediately revise that idea to fit the current materialist circumstances.
Hey, I don't think that's a bad thing. You know, we're iterating. That's what we're doing. Okay, so I'm Steve. I guess we're doing this introduction where we say who we are. I'm Steve, and I'm a recovering academic.
I'm Tim. I'm a current academic.
We are going to be talking today about Ukraine, which, you know, I think maybe 2 weeks ago now we said we were horribly underqualified to be talking about. We've done a little bit of our own research, and I think over the course of the last 2 weeks, I think a lot of folks have been brought up to speed on what's going on in Ukraine and what led to the crisis. Well, war, not just crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to go over some of that stuff. You know, we'll try to keep it light and do our best, and hopefully we can fill in some gaps for folks. But I think where we wanted to start today was with some follow-ups. We had said that we are a podcast that does follow-ups.
Yes.
So we are going to do that. And I think you wanted to start with a story about CERB.
Yeah, there was two stories that I think need to be sort of read together that came out in the past week that angered me and probably should anger other people. Mm-hmm. CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, is doing follow-ups with some people, not everyone, who received CERB in 2020, basically saying, justify that you deserved to receive CERB payments. Like, did you meet the appropriate criteria? Were you supposed to be paid money? And so people, you know, and most people who collect CERB collected it legally, and most people who collected CERB, whether they were entitled to or not, are low-income people. Right? They are people who did lose their job. So the CRA is going after these people. At the same time, there's a story that broke that Georgian Peaks is an exclusive ski resort. And this exclusive ski resort received $1.4 million in federal funding, federal COVID funding. So this was through various benefits that businesses could apply to for CERB. Now, this exclusive ski resort is a private club. You have to pay $43,000 to join. It has annual dues of $3,000. And last year, it showed a budgetary surplus of $1.5 million after receiving $1.4 million from the government.
Yeah. I'm going to interrupt you because this is actually pretty funny. I was looking for the article that you're referencing so I can put it in the show notes. And I found a Ottawa area club. A different club, the Royal Ottawa Golf Club, same story, $1 million surplus after being aided by the COVID-19 relief loans.
Yep.
And yeah, it seems like it's just happening everywhere. We're hearing these stories. And I'm not surprised.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not surprised.
We should be. We should be, like, you know, outraged and surprised at the same time.
I think you can be outraged and not surprised. So this club claims they followed all the... It should also be noted the club only paid $13,000 in income tax. They showed a $1.5 million surplus, paid $13,000 in income tax. But they claimed they followed all the rules. We didn't do anything wrong. They followed all the rules. Mm-hmm. And that's true.
Yeah.
And there's probably going to be a bunch of people who say... The club, these two clubs, this golf club, this ski club, and I'm sure it's not just limited to the two, followed all the rules, and these poor people over here broke the rules. You have to follow the rules. And my point is, the rules are broken.
Yeah. Yeah, the rules are set up such that individuals who lost their jobs early in the pandemic, individuals who were struggling throughout, are being put under, undue scrutiny to recoup a couple $1,000s. while our tax code allows mega corporations to walk off without spending any. And that's just considered, the usual.
I think, not to relitigate the last episode, but occasionally working and poor people can extract things from the Canadian government. But generally, there is a ruling class in Canada, and the Canadian government governs for that ruling class. And so that's why I'm not surprised, but I am outraged just seeing these stories and saying, like, yep, the Canadian government is not a government for me and you. It never has been and likely never will be.
Yeah. And, just to kind of put a final nail on this as well, I thought it was really interesting, when these programs were first announced, all of a sudden we saw this like rapid expansion of the welfare state, this rapid expansion of programs to help people as soon as it started to affect homeowners, people who have to pay mortgages, people with salaries. But, these programs don't exist for people who lose their jobs if they're working minimum wage or they're working part-time or if they're renters. We just don't give a flying fuck about those people.
Yep.
So it's there. We can do it. We just don't want to.
Yep.
Okay. Well, that's a great point to start off on.
Yeah.
All right. So about that Ukraine. Yeah. Why don't you start us off? Tell us about NATO, Tim.
So NATO. I think NATO is one of the first things that's sort of being litigated about this conflict. And as a leftist, I understand NATO to be part of a broad apparatus of American imperialism. So NATO is a defense pact, sure, but it also serves to secure economic, political, and cultural interests of the United States of America. It's what it does.
It's the stick they're carrying behind their back, right? Like everywhere they go, they've got this big stick, and they can say, "Oh, go ahead and try to stop us." And
I think it's, we should also understand that Canada has been a willing participant in American imperialism, that we are a junior partner in American imperialism, that we have tended to also participate in the exporting of American ideas and American economic interests. I think a lot of Canadians have this vision as, Canada as the peacekeeping country, right? The country that wears the blue UN helmets on their head, and that's what our role around the world is to keep the peace. It's not. Our contributions to peacekeeping have steadily declined since the mid-1990s. There has not been a year where our contributions to peacekeeping have not declined. And this is probably a separate episode that we may or may not ever do, but Canada's foreign policy on issues like Venezuela, on Israel-Palestine, and on China are just totally in line with the United States of America.
Yeah, we're just America Junior. Whatever Daddy says, we go along with.
And I think the other sort of thing about NATO is we might be two crackpots. I'm willing to engage in the thesis that we might be two crackpots. Yeah. But there are other crackpots like us. There is a history on the left of being very suspicious of NATO. So I was looking this up, and in 1969, so during the Cold War, members of the NDP voted for the party policy to be call on Ottawa to withdraw from NATO.
Wow.
So there's a long history here of the party leadership being more to the center than the party grassroots, and the leadership reversed this decision, but there was at least a majority of New Democrat members in the 70s who said Canada shouldn't be part of NATO.
Yeah, that's shocking. You wrote this in our show notes, and I was very surprised to see that, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Like last year, Sven Robinson, who's sort of one of these he's always been on the left of the NDP. Sven Robinson very famously heckled Ronald Reagan when Ronald Reagan addressed the Canadian House of Commons, so he can do no wrong because of that, as far as I'm sure. But yeah, he, even last year in 2021, said, why is the NDP not pressuring Canada to remove itself from NATO? Why is this not New Democratic policy in 2021?
Yeah, I mean... Yeah, why not? I mean, one thing I saw recently over the last couple days is that there's been a lot of criticism on Canada as being, quote unquote, a freeloader within NATO. I got one solution to that problem. just leave.
We just leave.
Yeah, we don't have to pay anything if we're not part of it.
Correct.
Yeah. Anyway. Okay. All right. So, and that's what Russia has said is one of the origins of this conflict, right? That they felt they were fearful that Ukraine would join NATO and that would present a threat to Russia. I've seen, in the last few days, I've been looking at a lot of maps of Ukraine. And actually, I'll in the show notes, I'm going to link, there's an open source conflict map of Ukraine at liveuamap.com. And it lists, all of the sort of ongoing events. I can see right now there was something posted about a half hour ago about protests in Kherson. Yeah, there's a lot of really great information on here, and you can kind of see the rough outlines of the conflict as it goes on. But anyway, related to that, I've also been looking at some topographical maps of the area, and like certainly, there are reasons that Russia would fear Ukraine joining NATO. Like I do understand that to a certain degree.
I think it's possible to have two ideas at the same time, and you can accept that Ukraine joining NATO would be perceived by the Russian state to be a security threat to the Russian state. You can also accept that their current activities in engaging with war in Ukraine is wrong.
Yeah, it strikes me as very strange that Russia would all of a sudden feel that there's a threat from U.S. imperialism or just the encroachment of capitalism like into their borders, when like what we've been seeing over the last few days is all these like mega corporations from McDonald's to Coca-Cola pulling out of Russia, and it's sort of like it had me, I don't know about you, but it had me kind of scratching my head going like, what are they afraid of exactly? Like it feels like they've opened the doors to this kind of economic and cultural imperialism, and now all of a sudden they're worried about it.
Yeah, I don't know. That's something I certainly don't understand. One thing that, because I'm terminally online, I listen to a lot of other podcasts, and one thing that I think is really important is that whenever we hear anything about Russia, so stuff about this, it is first usually filtered through Russian media and then filtered through Western American media.
Right.
And so there's a lot of things like American corporations in Russia that I don't understand because I don't even know where to begin to start to understand it.
Yeah. All I know is I saw a lot of footage yesterday of people lining up in Russia to get their last taste of McDonald's before they closed all their branches. Anyway,
so it's 1990, right? It's 1990. The Cold War is winding down. The USSR is collapsing. And there's this... So one of the things that seems to be really brought up is, did NATO promise Russia that it would not expand eastward?
Yeah.
And the answer is maybe.
Yeah.
So...
This really does seem to be... I was looking around as well. I see you wrote a lot in our notes about, sort of the back and forth on this. No one seems to know. It sounds like there was maybe a verbal agreement, and Russia took that one way, and NATO took it a different way.
Yeah, so Gorbachev claims that he was promised that NATO would not expand, quote, as much as a thumb's width further east. And so U.S. officials, even the U.S. officials that were apparently there, are split on this. Some American officials said, oh yeah, we told Gorbachev that. Another one said, we absolutely did not tell Gorbachev that. So the German newspaper Der Spiegel, which is a good newspaper, did a lot of reporting on this in 2009, and they had access to classified documents from both Britain and West Germany, and they concluded that there was no doubt that the West did everything it could to give Soviets the impression that NATO membership was out of the question for Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia.
Okay. I mean,
yeah,
that seems pretty conclusive.
But one of the problems about this is the USSR was so paranoid about the collapse of the USSR that they demanded everything be written down. everything. There was, treaties that were negotiated about Soviet military graveyards in Eastern Europe and how they would be tended to, which they wrote down on. But there was nothing written down about this supposed promise not to go eastward.
Oh, that's interesting.
Here's where I get stuck. Was there a promise from NATO to Russia about eastward expansion? Maybe. Maybe not. Was the promise about NATO expanding into East Germany or to all eastward expansion? Unclear. And then what I think actually matters for this, to understand the war in Ukraine, if there was a promise and it was in 1990 and it was not written down, is NATO supposed to continue to honor this verbal agreement 32 years later?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, and we're going to talk about the Ukrainian Revolution. We're going to talk about the Donbass region, Crimea. The other part of this, and the thing that I don't know if there's enough people talking about this, is even if there was an agreement, are you supposed to continue honoring that agreement when Russia is invading another country?
Yeah, exactly.
Like when they are doing things to undermine, the Ukrainian people and undermining their attempts at autonomy, and trying to pull them back into Russia. Is NATO supposed to just stand back and say, "Yeah, well, we made this agreement, so we're not going to do anything"?
Exactly. Yeah. NATO is not a good actor. I want to circle back around at this point. NATO is part of the broad American imperial apparatus.
Right.
Just because NATO is a bad actor, and just because maybe in this case NATO is breaking a promise that may or may not have been made from 32 years ago, doesn't mean that Russia is a good actor. Mm-hmm. Right? Two things can be bad at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. I think, we're going to probably talk about sanctions at some point, and that, it's the same thing where it's no, it's not good. It's not good for working Russians. It's not good for people who, depend on paychecks. But what else are you going to do? And so we'll get to that.
So the last part about this NATO thing, which I think is worth just touching on, is were there good faith negotiations over the past year about Russian security concerns? Maybe, maybe not. There's a non-answer here. Mm-hmm. Depends what you mean by good faith. It depends if you believe that Russia can engage in good faith negotiations or that the United States can. The United States is saying we've been trying to address these security concerns. Russia's saying they haven't. I tend to choose none of the above. I tend to be skeptical of both official statements from the United States and from Russia on this question.
Yeah. Well, our hands are not clean here either. But we'll wait. We'll talk about that at the end. I'm going to talk about the Ukrainian Revolution, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Okay, so back in 2013, the president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, he's an ally to Russia. He's rejecting any attempts to pull Ukraine into the EU. He doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. So, he's essentially a puppet for Russia. And this, goes full puppet when the Euromaidan protests erupt in Ukraine in November 2013. And he flees to Russia, where I think he's still living. Am I correct in that?
Yes. As an aside, I had read it in my mind as Euromaidan, which I was like,
oh yeah,
that's a pretty fantastic metal band name.
No, I watch YouTube, so I know how to pronounce it.
Okay.
So basically, these protests erupt because Yanukovych's refusal to sign a political association, free trade agreement with the EU. He doesn't want to join the EU, and Ukrainians get upset. Mm-hmm. So this turns into a full-fledged revolution, and Yanukovych is eventually exiled, as we were saying, to Russia. Interestingly, his did you get this little detail? His palace was turned into the Museum of Corruption.
I did not. Yeah,
so the Ukrainian people have designated his home, which I think was originally actually built during the USSR. But he had stocked it with all these gold statues and fountains and all this ridiculous shit, And they have kept that all intact and designated it as the Museum of Corruption, which is pretty fantastic.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. So anyway, Russia has decides that this is not good. And I think you had put this quote: "Russia will do everything allowable by law to stop the opposition from coming to power." And in February 2014, Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement urging Ukrainians to crack down on the extremists who are trying to get established in power, and just refuse to recognize Ukraine as legitimate government.
Yeah. There's this thing about this revolution where some people are claiming that it wasn't a revolution, that it was an American-backed coup.
Sure.
And okay, so America likes to coup.
Both of us can believe that.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is like America is nice country you've got there. It'd be a shame if your democratically elected government was overthrown by the CIA, right? Like,
sure.
Okay. I don't believe it was a coup. But if in the future, where the future is literally tomorrow until the heat death of the universe, evidence could come out and say that, no, everything that happened in Ukraine was backed by the CIA. I'd be like, yeah, of course. I now believe that. It is a very easy thing for me to believe, but I don't believe it today.
Right.
My major problem is this narrative seems to suggest that the people of Ukraine have no agency.
Right.
That this revolution against a leader who is corrupt to the point where there is apparently a palace to corruption, a leader which was seen by many Ukrainians as being a puppet of Russia, and a leader who did not support an expansion into the EU, and we can litigate if the EU is good or not, but people of Ukraine seem to want it.
Yeah.
It seems like the people of Ukraine had a lot of real reasons that they wanted to throw out this leader. A lot of this discussion of a coup comes back to this leaked recorded conversation where the Assistant Secretary of State and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine discussed their wishes for Ukraine to transition to an intern government. And then they said what they wanted their preferred roles for people to be. It's possible for nation states to have preferred outcomes without forcing those outcomes. The parallel in my mind was there's this interview about 2 weeks before the 2016 American election where Justin Trudeau was asked about the possibilities of the outcome of the election, and he made this joke at the time where he's like, Americans are an independent people and we will respect the results of whatever that election is. I look forward to working with Hillary Clinton. And there was much laughter. And because the Prime Minister of Canada has expressed an interest in one leader winning an election in the United States does not mean that, like, I don't know, we sent the Mounties to go, install Hillary Clinton as our puppet, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, this is their job, right? American Assistant Secretary of State and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. Yeah, of course they talk about that stuff. Why? It would be weird if they didn't, if you ask me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay, maybe a coup, maybe not. Certainly, I mean, it would strike me as advantageous for the U.S. to fund this, but as we're seeing this right now with the war. Like, the Ukrainian people clearly have some sort of self-agency, want to be self-governed. Like, that's why they're fighting so fucking hard in this war. Anyway,
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, yeah. So we're 5 years on from that. President Zelensky, everyone's new favorite. Oh man. Should we talk about how everyone wants to fuck him now? Is that
I don't know. That's just why I don't like engaging with anything online and seeing what, liberals say online. It's like, could we have anything? Look, you don't need to do a 2-hour-long rambling podcast, but you also can provide some modicum of real political analysis other than dude is hot.
Yeah. the standard has just become to venerate heroes, turn them into sex objects. Like Fauci, what was the governor of New York who ended up being a sex pest?
Oh, Cuomo.
Yeah.
I'm Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah, we're Cuomo-sexuals. So there's Zelensky-sexuals now? Are people claiming that? Where's the t-shirts? I'm sure they exist. Anyway, Zelensky becomes president in 2019. And yeah, he seems to be, a lot further from Russia than a lot of the other presidents they've had.
And that's the other thing that irritates me is there was a president between the ousted...
yes.
Between... Yanukovych and Zelensky. So, like, what is the CIA doing? Let me understand this. They have a coup, and then there's a president, but that's not the president that is the puppet of the United States, so they have to wait an entire election cycle? Like, I don't know. I am just screaming for, like, one modicum of critical thought here.
Mm-hmm. No, we don't do that here.
No. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So that sort of sets the groundwork for, the beginning of what I would call like, the first stages of this war. Like we have two regions that quickly kind of fall into the hands of pro-Russian militants. So why don't you take us through those?
So the first is the Donbass region, and the Donbass region is located in eastern Ukraine. It has historically close ties to Russia. So it's a part of Ukraine that is close culturally to Russia. And so throughout 2014, immediately following the revolution, there was a good deal of violence in the Donbass region. Pro-Russian militants, so Ukrainian pro-Russian militants, seized control of a number of government buildings. And these pro-Russian protesters pushed for a referendum. They wanted the Donbass region to be independent from Ukraine. They seized control of local government buildings and demanded that these local parliaments call for a referendum. And they said, well, if you don't call for a referendum, we're just going to take control unilaterally of the government and declare we're independent.
Right.
And so this group appealed to Putin to say, send peacekeeping forces into the region. So there was this referendum in May of 2014 where 89% of voters voted for self-rule. And this vote was not seen as legitimate. Neither Ukraine nor the international community. I mean, if you're telling legislators, have a referendum, and if you don't, we're just going to take control, it's not democratically legitimate.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've already taken control as well, right? You've already shown that you're willing to enact violence on these people if they don't vote your way, and then you're claiming that's the other part too, right? These numbers, like who provided these numbers, you know? And as you were saying, everything gets filtered through the sort of prism of Russian intelligence, Russian propaganda as well, right? So
I think I understand this as one of the first, leading up to this conflict, was one of the first major steps of Russian imperialism, right? These were separatist forces backed by Russia. This was Russia attempting to encroach into the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Yeah. I just can't help but notice the similarities between these tactics and the ones that are employed by right-wing militias in the United States. So you could go back as far as like 7 years ago when those like yokels invaded the governor's office in California, or more recently there was the example with the group trying to kidnap and assassinate the governor of Michigan, just because they didn't like her. And I mean, the obvious example is January 6th, but in every instance the attempt is to take power first and then articulate our demands later.
Yeah. So this leads to Crimea.
Which I think most people have probably heard about. Like, I think that's sort of where people have been picking up this story, going back to, I guess, 2014. Yeah.
So Crimea is another part of this. Okay. I pulled my hair out trying to figure out the history of the status of Crimea. If there's one area of all the things that I am unsure about what we are talking about, Crimea is one of them. So Crimea,
that's not just you.
So Crimea has a large ethnic Russian population. And many of these ethnic Russians were retired military personnel, or they worked with the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So, Crimea has either been part of Ukraine, it's an autonomous region within Ukraine, it's fully autonomous. It's very confusing to try to sort out.
Right.
But Russian hostilities, so I think this lengthy conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it appeared on my radar with the Russian annexation of Crimea.
Yeah, same.
February, March, Russia invades and annexes Crimea from Ukraine.
Yeah.
And said, this part of Ukraine is actually part of Russia. It's always been part of Russia, and now it's part of Russia again. We're taking it over.
Yeah, which sounds like bullshit, and sounds like it's the same line they've been using now for Ukraine generally. And what's worrying about that is it's that same rhetoric can be used to justify invading lots of other former USSR powers, some of which are in NATO. So this might be the beginning of much worse things to come. Hopefully not.
So we have this sort of fake referendum. Crimean parliament votes to hold a referendum. Conditions of the votes really need to be highlighted.
Yeah.
Russian troops had occupied the building. So Russian troops were in the Crimean parliament. They took the phones away from the members of parliament. No journalists were allowed inside the building.
Yeah.
Many members of the Crimean parliament were threatened at gunpoint to vote one way. And others claim that votes were cast by people who weren't even in the chamber. So this vote to have a referendum, not democratic. If you're being told to vote one way at gunpoint, that is, the literal definition of not democratic.
Right.
So 95% of people in this referendum voted for joining Russia. That's dubious.
Yeah.
And only Putin has recognized the Republic of Crimea as independent. We have said, and we take the position, NATO is a bad actor. We are not a pro-NATO podcast. But
no, we're not.
Russia is also a bad actor here. These are the support of the militants in Donbass and in Crimea is Russian imperialism. It is Russia attempting to expand through the use of force their empire and colonizing other formerly independent and sovereign nations.
Yeah, ones that happen to have a lot of access to natural resources, accesses to the Black Sea. It strikes me as a strategically advantageous place for Russia to expand and take up more space and take up more resources and possibly build up to a superpower position once again.
Yeah, so if you want to accept the line that Russia's responding to a security threat, which I don't really think that they are, but it's still an act of imperialist aggression. It is still not good.
Yeah. No, one of the claims Putin has made is that he's going to denazify the military. And when I saw that, I remembered, I went back and I found some stories from as early as 2020, I think, of Canadian Nazis going over to train military personnel in Ukraine. So there's always a nugget of truth within the lies that Russia spreads, right? They're always seizing upon these very small stories of a couple individuals and then elevating it to the point where it looks like a justification for, say, this invasion or any other sort of actions that they want to take.
they're referring to this thing, which you may or may not have heard of, depending on how much you're looking at this, called the Azov Battalion.
Yeah, that's right.
And the Azov Battalion is a problem. They are a neo-Nazi Ukrainian National Guard unit.
Yeah.
They are nationalists, so they are pro-Ukraine, they are anti-Russia, but they're neo-Nazis. Members of this unit wear neo-Nazi and actual Nazi patches and paraphernalia. The former leaders and current leaders are ultra-right-wing nationalists. The unit's first commander ran in Ukrainian elections as a neo-Nazi,
Right.
like as a member of the neo-Nazi party. And the battalion has committed a number of war crimes. They have looted civilian homes. They are complicit in kidnapping. They are complicit in torture. They are complicit in sexual violence.
Yeah.
And as you said, they've drawn from neo-Nazi and white nationalist organizations around the world. There are people who are Nazis who have gone to Ukraine to join the Azov Battalion because it is a white nationalist neo-Nazi battalion.
Yeah.
So they are part of a problem.
It is, for sure. It is absolutely. But I think I'm trying not to engage in whataboutism, because there's been a lot of that over the last few weeks, especially
Yes.
on the left, which, we love to do that. And we love to always make the U.S. the bad guy. So, I can use the U.S. as an example, but I could use the Canadian Armed Forces as an example. I could use the Canadian Police as an example. Within institutions that enforce this type of authoritarian rule and have a monopoly on state violence, you are going to attract people who want to use that to beat the shit out of not white people. Like, that's just how it is. I don't really know how you avoid that problem except having a smaller force, being really, really careful about who you let in. Should the Ukrainian government have, been a little more careful to not let those forces proliferate? Sure. Do I think they're a huge part of the military? Probably not. And do I think it's just a justification that Putin is using and nothing more? Absolutely. What was interesting, I was gonna say, this is one little. I'm gonna put my little conspiracy theory out there. People have been speculating on why the Russian army has been putting Z's on their tanks, especially considering that's not even part of the alphabet. And I noticed that it has a striking resemblance to the Azov Battalion's logo. Sort of just, it is a Z sort of on its side with a cross through it. And yeah, I'm who knows, but my speculation is that potentially is a sort of emblem that they're using to sort of carry on this lie that is the reason that they're there. And that's something very easy for people to get behind, because who the fuck likes Nazis?
Yeah, the Azov Battalion is very bad, but Putin is not engaging in a mission to denazify the Azov Battalion.
No.
Putin is engaging in imperialist expansion, full stop.
Yeah, it's bullshit, right? It's absolute bullshit. It's so very clear that it's bullshit, but if you're in Russia and if you're only getting Russian news, and increasingly that is all that is accessible to people, it's easy to convince folks when there's no alternative messaging. Okay, so on that note, news has been one of the many things that people can no longer get access to in Russia. There have been very, very widespread sanctions on the Russian people. And leaders and officials, but yeah, why don't we talk a little bit about that?
It's interesting because you said you started with on Russian people, and when this conflict first started on the first days of the war, there were widespread demonstrations in Russia against the invasion. There were thousands of people who have been arrested, thousands of Russians who were arrested for protesting the war.
Yeah.
A good section of the Russian people are not in favor of this war.
No, and people in general are not in favor of wars. What the hell did they have to gain from it?
And so initially, the initial discussion of these sanctions were the sanctions were going to be on Russian leaders and Russian oligarchs, but the discourse has now shifted to crushing the Russian economy. And I don't see how that's a good thing. I mean, to the extent that if I was asked, do sanctions work? I would say sanctions played a role in collapsing the apartheid regime in South Africa. And that's the only time I can point to really where sanctions were useful. Because generally, sanctions are not weathered by billionaires. The nature of being a billionaire means you can weather sanctions.
Yeah.
Sanctions are weathered by working and poor people.
Yeah, that's right. I wanted to update. You said like thousands of people. This was a news story from today, actually. So on the weekend, I guess 5,000 people were arrested in 69 cities just on Sunday in Russia.
Yeah.
So there is like a groundswell of anti-war protesters in Russia. I think like the way that the global hegemony understands this is that you put sanctions on a country and that makes the working people rise up. Now,
but it doesn't.
No, like to my mind, it just makes it harder to rise up, right? To my mind, these 5,000 people that were arrested, like how are they now going to afford to kind of like pull themselves out of whatever economic hardship that is going to be visited upon them? Maybe they lose their job if they even had one because they were arrested, they were put in prison, now they have a record potentially. And they might not even be able to post bail if that's even a thing. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. And so we're all very proud in Ontario that we've pulled Russian vodka from the shelves of the liquor store.
Yeah.
And because it's just something that we're all cheering for. And my thought was like, this is just pure symbolism.
Oh, of course.
Because the owner of that distillery company, which is a corporation, doesn't care.
No.
Will it lead to layoffs within the production factories? Maybe. Don't know. Don't know how much liquor this corporation produces and where it sells it worldwide. So let's suppose that, and again, let's suppose that the LCBO pulling Russian vodka leads to layoffs of Russian working people in these factories. And now they are laid off from their job, and they are told the reason they are laid off from their job is because Canada is not purchasing this vodka because Canada doesn't approve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you are a Russian working person who maybe also doesn't approve of the invasion of Ukraine, and you exist in a authoritarian country which has had one leader for decades, and you oppose that leader, these sanctions have just hurt you and not that leader, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And has probably made you more pissed off, not at the leader that you were already potentially pissed off at, but at this country on the other side of the globe that has made a decision that's put you out of work. And again, I don't know. Let's examine the last, say, 100 years of global history and look at what happens when people who are the victims of Western sanctions and Western imperialism decide not a fan of this.
Yeah.
Well,
look at Afghanistan. You don't have to look 100 years. You have to look like 1 year.
Yeah.
The reason the Taliban was able to, in addition to spending a decade insulating child molesters, the U.S. government just made it impossible to live a decent life in Afghanistan, and Iraq before that, and that makes people angry, and it makes them want to not go along with whatever the fuck your plan is, to do exactly the opposite.
So I think sanctions could be useful to punish the billionaires around Putin. I think that does work, but I think just in 2 weeks, the move from punish those closest to Putin to isolate Russia, isolate the Russian economy, has the effect of punishing the Russian working class and poor Russians, who we have seen a large number of whom don't want to have anything to do with this war.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the consequences of this are not great. One of the things that I think is really frustrating for a lot of people is you wake up, you see that Russia has invaded Ukraine, and you think, what can I do about it? And you very quickly realize absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing that we can do here. And I think you can do things like go to demonstrations that oppose the war, go to demonstrations. I think going to demonstrations is useful.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to boycott Russian products, that might punish Russian billionaires, but it's probably just going to punish poor Russians. And I think the thing that gets frustrating for me is I can very easily reach the conclusion NATO is a bad actor, Putin is a bad actor. I want to engage in a position that supports working and poor people in both Ukraine and Russia, but I don't know how to do that in the confines of the system we live in.
No, I don't either. To go back to this question of sanctions and the sort of thought experiment you did with the LCBO and workers being laid off at this distillery, the thing that really frustrates me is people in this country, people I talk to and I'm sure you talk to, say things like, "Oh well, I don't vote because it doesn't change anything," or "What can I do?" It seems like the march of the march of the right wing, the march of capitalism goes on never ending, and there's nothing we can do to affect that change. So how do you think these people who've had one fucking president for 2 decades, how do you think they feel?
Yeah.
There is no world in which removing people's ability to feed their families and keep the heat on, literally in some cases here, is going to lead to them rising up against this guy who's been there for 20 years and just disappears people, whenever the fuck he wants to. Openly poisoned his opponent in the last election, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not for the first time either.
No.
And I don't know. I'd like to be hopeful. I'd like to think that, maybe he let the opposition kind of grow a little too much over the last few years, and that there will be some kind of popular resistance that's fueled by worsening economic conditions. But I'm just not hopeful that will happen. I don't know. I don't know how you do that.
I think one of the concrete answers of what can we do is be supportive of refugees. So we've seen a refugee crisis, millions of refugees, millions of people fleeing Ukraine. Some of them will end up in Canada, and I think we need to be supportive of that on a community level and on a national level, and openly recognize that people who are fleeing war have a home wherever they can find that home.
Well, Tim, I don't think that's going to be a problem because these ones happen to be white.
Yeah, so that's the other thing is, and again, I think we're not the first people to point that out.
No.
But there is already a discourse that there are good refugees who are fleeing from Ukraine as opposed to the bad refugees who are fleeing from Syria and other war-torn nations. And that's where, again, I think we should both recognize that there is an immediate refugee crisis coming out of Ukraine, but there's an ongoing refugee crisis coming out of Syria and other war-torn regions. And that, I think one of the things we have a responsibility to do as leftists is to constantly push back and say that anyone who is fleeing war-torn regions has a home in a place where they can find it, and we have to do as much as we can to support them. We saw really disgusting discourse around Syrian refugees are like, well, we're going to spend money on healthcare for them. Like, absolutely fucking right we are.
Yeah.
Like, that's what we're going to do. And we're not seeing that discourse around Ukraine. And I think, again, we need to push back and say, okay, we're going to accept these refugees. And in fact, we're going to accept all refugees.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to do.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I'm still struggling with, like, why are we even doing this podcast? And, like, maybe that's the reason, is, like, what you're saying about, what the voices that we heard coming out of Syria and refugee crisis, people being really critical about, how we're going to pay for this and, how come they get to go first, sort of that sort of stuff. Those voices come from the right. And it's, like, another area where if we're not sort of speaking our truth and giving people an alternative that's, perhaps utopian, perhaps idealistic, then that space is just going to be flooded by voices from the right. They're very fucking loud. They don't shut up, and so we sort of have a responsibility to meet them on that, like, battlefield of ideas, at least.
Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about how we can think about foreign policy generally? Do we want to do that?
Yeah, I do. It's okay. So it's been a couple weeks since we recorded a podcast, and I was sort of dreading this one, and I think it comes back to the points that we were just talking about like feeling like we just can't solve this problem or can't help in any meaningful way. It feels like the toothpaste has been squeezed out of the tube, and we're not going to be able to put it back in this case. But maybe we can devise a system to make sure that the next tube doesn't get squeezed out. So I think it's useful in that sense, and I just wanted to kind of, like, acknowledge that, on both sides of this conversation, and I'm sure for our listeners as well, it doesn't feel good. Nothing feels good. The sanctions don't feel good. War obviously does not feel good. It doesn't feel good to be talking about Nazis within the Ukrainian military. Like, none of these things feel good. But I think they're worth discussing, and I think whatever.
So whenever I've been thinking about this war for the past 2 weeks, at risk of repeating myself, it's like, okay, as leftists, we oppose imperialism, and imperialist projects can come from both NATO and its allies and Russia. Imperialism is bad.
Yeah.
And then I guess my first filter is always, to the extent as possible, is any concrete effort going to improve the conditions of those living in war, those fleeing war, and generally improve the conditions of working and poor people? I think that should be a question about foreign policy in general on the left. Is this policy going to materially improve the circumstances of working and poor people? And that's where I think you and I have landed on, like, sanctions are kind of dubious, if not outright bad, because they really don't. Right. They make those circumstances worse. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly in the context of, like, the toothpaste being out of the tube, so to speak. What else can you do? You know what I mean? I really just don't know. But it certainly seems like it's hurting working people. Like, that seems to be, the biggest outcome of these types of sanctions. Like, again, what you were saying, the oligarchs, the billionaires, they're just lounging on their yachts.
Yeah, so we're both anti-capitalist, and part of the problem is you go, okay, capitalism is bad. Agreed. How do you get rid of capitalism? That's the tricky part. Right. So imperialism is bad, and if countries would just stop engaging in imperialism, we'd have less problems in the world. Agreed, but I don't think that's going to happen tomorrow. So What are some stances that, we can advocate for as leftists? And I think one of them is, to take lessons from the NDP of the 1970s or Sven Robinson from last year, is agitate for removing ourselves from apparatuses of global imperialism.
Right.
Like, if you are a member of the NDP, if you are a member of the Green Party, if you are a member of these parties, adopt the position that the party line should be leave these organizations.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some ways, like, challenge people and be annoying at their own game on the right. So we've seen in the past few days, Justin Trudeau has said Canada is going to revisit how much money we're going to spend on NATO. And I think every time that comes up into political discourse, ask how are we going to pay for it? Because anytime those of us on the left say we should give away things like healthcare, well, how are you going to pay for it?
Yeah.
And so I think the question needs to be, if we're going to spend more money on NATO, how are we going to pay for that? What social programs are going to be cut so we can increase our contributions to NATO? Because we're not going to pay for it by increasing taxes in this country.
No, of course not.
So, if you want to increase defense spending, does that mean I have less access to healthcare?
Probably. I mean,
yeah.
I just saw an article today that Doug Ford wants to bring back private hospitals. So that's cool. That's good.
Yeah.
We're going in the right direction for sure.
I think, okay. What else can we do?
Well, I was going to say too, I think it's incumbent on us as leftists to carry on the long tradition of critiquing capitalism wherever we can. And it strikes me that nobody really has brought forward a critique of the war as being a failure of capitalism in a very real sense. Like, we saw the USSR become Russia and adopt free market policies and trade their oil and gas all around the world and bring in corporations like McDonald's and Coca-Cola, like we were talking about earlier. And that wasn't enough. It's never enough. Capitalism does not ratchet down these conflicts. If anything, it ratchets them up. That's what we keep seeing over and over and over again.
Where did these oligarchs come from, by the way?
Yeah.
They came from the marketization of the USSR.
Right, exactly. That's my point. Like, we have been fed this lie that capitalism is supposed to ameliorate all these problems, that integrating world economies was going to make us more dependent on each other and therefore less likely to have conflict. And yet, here we are again with poor people going in to fight wars to protect, or in this case, expand the elite's economic interests.
This is going to seem like a sharp turn to some of the people listening, and I promise I'm going to bring it back home. I did my PhD research on the Canadian Auto Workers Union, which no longer exists. They're now called Unifor. And part of the CAW's struggle against apartheid, because they said, as a trade union, we are opposed to South African apartheid, and we should do everything we can, was to build links with South African trade unions. And by that, like, concretely, to have members of South African trade unions address delegations of the CAW, to have CAW members go to South Africa and work with trade unions there. And I'm going to say that, because just what you said, that people who fight wars are poor people, I think we can say that this can be somewhat instructive for a broad left foreign policy. Build meaningful coalitions with working and poor people around the world. Understand that the leftist position that my interests are more with the working people in Ukraine and the working people in Russia than they are with the imperialist government in Canada, the United States, or Russia. So, and whether that be through formal channels like working within trade unions, whether that be with networking online, whether that be with supporting organizations that build these bridges that recognize that there's more in common with the people of these nations than there are with the ruling classes of these nations. Support those types of mechanisms, formally through trade unions or informally through civil society as much as you can.
Yeah. That seems like good armor to me as well, right? Like, we've been talking about sort of the information war within Russia and clamping down on what they claim is misinformation. And there's stories, again, like, you always have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, but there are stories of Russian soldiers coming into Ukraine believing that they were going to be welcomed as liberators, which, that's an old story. But like, our ability to undermine that sort of level of information control starts and ends at our ability to talk with people. And so, like, forming those relationships ahead of time, again, this toothpaste is out of the tube. But forming those relationships ahead of time, creating those sort of bonds of solidarity between working people gives you another avenue for speaking to people and saying, actually, that's not true. Actually, you're being lied to.
If you are a person who is listening to this podcast and you have made it, this far into our discussion, I guarantee to you, you are a person who has more in common with the Russians who were arrested for protesting the war than you do with the Russian oligarchs, with NATO, with the Canadian government, with the American government, or with Russian troops who are invading Ukraine, right? They are the people you have more in common with. You are a person who has more in common with the vodka worker who's been laid off than with the person who owns that distilling company.
Hey, or the people who voted to take it out of the LCBO.
Yeah.
Right? God.
There's very little. I think there's very little that we can do concretely. I think attending rallies for peace, rallies against the war is something we can do. I'm skeptical of supporting sanctions. I'm skeptical of things like pulling Russian products out of stores. We'll put in the show notes a link to the Red Cross operating in Ukraine, Ukrainian Red Cross. I think if you are a person who is able to donate to the Ukrainian Red Cross, it is something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's helping people who are fleeing. Like, though, the Red Cross seems to be playing the largest role in helping people get to safety right now. So, if you want to help people directly in like a very... God, I'm just running out of words, Tim.
Yeah. Okay, so... Yeah, I don't know how we end this podcast. This is not a podcast that we can end on a pleasing note. So
No.
We've tended to do a summary. I'm gonna do my. So we are a anti-imperialism podcast.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can agree on that. We are a pro-Ukrainian working and poor people podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I would say we're a pro-Ukrainian independence podcast.
Yeah, we are pro the working and poor people of Russia.
Yeah. I mean, I might even go further than that. I have empathy for these teenagers who have been brainwashed into fighting someone else's war.
Yeah. We'll come back in 2 weeks and we'll talk about something that might not be as depressing.
God, I hope so. Jesus Christ. This was not easy. I mean, the last 2 weeks have not been easy for anyone, I'm sure. But as much as I don't want this podcast to just be Canadian navel gazing, let's get back to some domestic policy. So I can feel less hopeless about the world, Tim. Thank you for talking to me today.
Well, I'll meet you on the barricade in the cool, defiant rain.